Agriculture thrives on ideal conditions. Drought, fire, flooding, and other severe weather events, all of which are expected to increase due to climate change, well, they're terrible for growing the food we all rely on. How might our food systems and our tastes have to change in light of a warming planet? Well, let's find out with, in Austin, Texas, via Skype, Tom Philpott, food and agriculture correspondent for Mother Jones magazine and the author of the forthcoming book, Perilous Bounty, The Looming Collapse of American Farming and How to Prevent It. In Washington, D.C., Janet Ranganathan, Vice President for Science and Research at the World Resources Institute. And here in our studio, Philip Loring, Errol Food Institute Chair in Food Policy and Society at the University of Guelph, and Laurie Stallbrand, Professor of Food Studies at George Brown College here in Toronto. And we welcome everybody, both here in our studio and in Points Beyond, to our discussion. Are you the same Laurie Stallbrand I used to work with at CBC 30 years ago?
That's right.
Oh my gosh, how long has it been since I saw you?
It has been many, many
Laurie,
years. We don't want to talk about it.
It's a delight to have you here, Laurie.
Very nice to be here, thank you.
Let's set this up, and Mr. Director, if you would mind bringing this graphic up so we can share this information with those watching and listening on podcast. According to the Errol Food Institute, farmers will have to produce 50% more food to feed a population of more than 9 billion people by the year 2050. 50% more food. However, climate models show that global crop production will decline every decade for the rest of this century due to drought, heat, and flooding. Climate change may reduce crop yields by 2% per decade over the next 100 years. Another estimate by the National Academy of Sciences in 2011 says that for every degree Celsius that the global thermostat rises, there will be a 5 to 15% decrease in overall crop production. Climate change also puts some of our tastiest foods in peril, including coffee, wine grapes, cherries, citrus fruits, and cacao. Is that how you say that?
Cacao.
Cacao, okay.
Cocoa.
In the words of food writer Amanda Little, quote, all the delicious foods are dying. Okay, we've got a serious disconnect here, and I want to start with Janet in Washington. Can you tell us, in your view, to what extent climate change is affecting our food system today?
Significantly. The impacts of climate change are already being felt globally. The yield of wheat has fallen. And as the temperature changes in precipitation and sea level rise hit in, we're going to see a lot worse. And this challenge is sort of exacerbated by the point that you made, Steve, which is that we have to increase the food produced by our system by 56%, actually around 56% between now and 2050, while contending with climate change impacts, as well as restricting the expansion of agriculture into the remaining forests, and doing this within a greenhouse gas emissions budget. So what I like to call the mother of all sustainability challenges, how to feed the world sustainably.
Indeed, it sounds like it. Tom, let me get you to follow up, because the food writer I just quoted, Amanda Little, has said that we can actually taste climate change in our food today. Can we?
I think it's true. I think maybe it's a little bit less true in the United States and maybe North America, in sort of the English-speaking part of North America, because we are, so far we are prosperous enough to where we have a steady supply of inexpensive food despite a bunch of recent shocks. But I think that what we're seeing is a fraying around the edges. We saw massive storms in the Midwest last year. This is our corn belt. This is our bread basket. And the storms didn't end up causing a lot of yield drop. They caused some yield drop. They caused some acres not to be planted. But the real hidden impact that I think that we are yet to see is the washing away of soil. Basically because the way that our food system works in the Corn Belt, which is the sort of upper Midwest of the United States, you basically have two crops grown, corn and soybeans, and nothing on the ground in the winter and spring. It's completely bare ground. So when these spring storms come raging in, you've got soil vulnerable to washing away, and that's exactly what happened last year. And so I think we're still at the beginning of seeing the effects of climate change here in the global north. And I think it's different in the global south. I think they've felt it more. And in the foods that you mentioned, we are seeing, those will be getting more expensive. for sure.
Lori, let me get you into this in as much as the pollinators. We depend on the pollinators for a lot of our food. And what impact do you see climate change having on our pollinators?
Definitely climate change is having an impact on pollinators. About 1/3 of our food is actually directly related to pollination and could not be produced without
food?
pollinators.
Name names.
All sorts of fruits and vegetables and tree fruits and things like almonds. It's actually a situation now where in California, they are bringing in bees that will pollinate the almond trees because there are not enough pollinators around. And we're seeing that all over the world. There's no question that this is a major issue. But there's an awful lot we can do about that.
Hold off on that.
And we will get into that.
We are surely going to do that. We're going to identify the problem first and then see if there's anything we can do about it. How about the fisheries, Philip? What is the impact on the fisheries so far of climate change?
You know, I'm glad you brought up fisheries because a lot of times they're left out, and fish are one of the most traded and consumed commodities in the world. About 20% of our protein comes from fish globally. And you know, as the atmosphere warms, a lot of people don't realize that much of the warming, maybe as much as 80%, is going into the oceans first. So you warm up water and you can imagine what happens. Fish go in different places, ecosystems change, predator-prey relationships decouple, and so you either see fish species that we're fishing for move north for colder waters, or move poleward rather, or they go deeper. And that has real implications for fishermen and fishing livelihoods, but also when we see sort of major population disruptions like in BC, Pacific coastal salmon or pollock, it impacts the market.
I have read accounts from, I guess, fishers, we call them now, right? Fishers, who say, that stuff in my net, I've never seen that before. We don't usually see that stuff up here. Bizarre, eh?
It is, and you know, you see species of salmon going up into Arctic rivers that you haven't seen. Well, there's oral histories about them being there, but not in a long time. And in the tropics, this is you know, where people rely on as much as 80% of their protein from the sea. Those fish can't tolerate much warmer waters, and so the entire livelihoods around fisheries will be really impacted.
Janet, to you for this one, CO2, of course, is a greenhouse gas, but it's also plant food. And I wonder what effect has more CO2 in the atmosphere had on the plants that we eat?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because some of the earlier Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change studies thought that actually increasing CO2 concentration in the atmosphere would actually increase food productivity. And to some degree it does, but some of the adverse impacts around weather changes kind of counter that. But I just want to go back to your quick question about, you know, can you actually taste climate change? Because there has been some research that shows that actually the nutrient quality of food actually declines under an increasing CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. So maybe you can't quite taste that, but certainly it has effect on the nutritional quality of food.
Gotcha. I'm going to read an excerpt here from a book that's coming out in a couple of months called Uncertain Harvest, and this will set the table for our discussion to come. Mr. Director, if you would. The complex web of imports and exports that makes up our current global food system itself looks a lot like the global banking system just before the 2008 crash. It's a system in which a few nations supply a disproportionate quantity of food to the rest of the world, in which a few major global transportation nodes facilitate much of the world's trade, in which 8 crops provides 3/4 of the world's calories, and in which a handful of multinational corporations control up to 90% of the world's grain trade. It doesn't take much to imagine a scenario in which something might happen. Tom, pick up the story if you would. How vulnerable is the food system today to the pressures being put on it by climate change?
I mean, I think it's extremely vulnerable. I mean, just to take the North American case as an example, we grow, you know, most of the vegetables that we consume, at least here in the United States, and I think it's also somewhat true for Europe and Canada, come from California. So we have this amazing productivity of California agriculture, and then the corn and the soybeans, you know, that feed the animal production system come from the Great Prairie. This contiguous with Canada in the Midwest. And so these regions are, these two regions, the West Coast and the Midwest, produce an amazing amount of the food that we eat. And both of them are under serious pressure from climate change. And I think that, you know, in California, obviously, agriculture there has outstripped water resources. They have amazing water resources there, but the food production machine of that place has outgrown it. The 20th century was an anomalously wet century, and we're having to adjust to much drier conditions and drier still with climate change. these storms in the Midwest are putting increasing pressure on soil. Soil is washing away at something like 15 times the rate of reproduction, if you look at the numbers there. And so concentrating into these two places that are right now uniquely vulnerable to climate change, I think ends up making us very, very vulnerable, and we need to rethink that system.
Well, I want to put the numbers that we used off the top to Lori and get your take on this, because we did say that in 30 years' time, there will be 9 billion people on this planet. Given the current state of the food system and the trajectory we seem to be on, will it be possible to feed that many people, given all of what we've discussed?
Well, there's a lot of dispute about exactly how much more food we're going to need to feed people. There's also a lot of dispute about whether adding more food production is actually what we have to do. In fact, a big part of what we need to look at is the current food system and what we're doing with that. So we waste 1/3 of the food that we produce, loss and waste. So loss is actually before it even gets to manufacturing or retail or the consumer, and waste is at that point, manufacturing, processing, retail, and in our homes.
Fully 1/3.
1/3.
This is North America?
This is across the globe. In North America, we even verge on getting up to 50%. There was an excellent study that came out last year that showed in Canada we're around 50%. So that if we stop wasting all that food, that's one big thing. The second thing is we're spending way too much time growing corn and soy monocultures, like the picture we have behind us here on the screen, which don't have any resilience in the face of climate change. They don't give us any biodiversity, and they're used to feed animals when we already have too much in the way of intensive livestock operations. So if we start to move away from that, the other big thing, of course, they're used for, especially the corn, is for ultra-processed foods, high fructose corn syrup. We don't even need these foods in our food system, and they're one of the big problems. They're also causing chronic health conditions. So if we start thinking about the food system differently, instead of just thinking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, sometimes that's called carbonism, just focusing on how do we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. But if we think about the whole food system, the food system can actually be part of the solution to our problems, not just the problem.
Philip, how much of that do you want to sign on to?
100%, really. The challenge of focusing on just one outcome, climate change is important, probably one of the biggest issues we're going to deal with in our lives. But our food systems are about a lot more than just producing food. They're about education, they're about connecting with the land, they're about stewardship and biodiversity and nutrition and family and so forth. And there's lots of opportunities out there to find solutions to this that diversify, that help farming families, because I would point out that in addition to our food being vulnerable, our farming families who already operate on a margin, partially because they're locked in to such a simple, complicated but vulnerable system, are also really vulnerable. Prairie farmers, for example, when they had that really wet year, really wet spring in 2019, that was hard. I work with a lot of farmers in Saskatchewan, and that was a rough year dealing with all that water. And so if we find a way to, as we're talking about here, to find solutions that don't just focus on one part of the problem, but are more systemic and look at the systematic, sort of the core drivers instead of the symptoms. Climate change is a bit of a symptom of bigger cultural problems that we need to address.
Janet, can I get you to weigh in on that?
Yes, actually, this is how do we sustainably feed the planet in 2050? This is a question that the World Resources Institute has looked at with its partners. We recently published something called Creating a Sustainable Food Future. And basically what that said is that, yes, we could do this, but there is no silver bullet. And we actually identified what we call a 5-course menu of solutions. The first course was about reducing demand for food. So Laurie mentioned food waste. That's one of those. We also need to shift diets towards, foods that are less land intensive. So beef, for example, uses 20 times the amount of land, produces 20 times the amount of greenhouse gas emissions as your average plant-based protein. We've got the issue of competition of land with biofuels. So that was the first course. Second course, and I want to emphasize this because we were surprised at how significant this was as a part of the solution. We actually need to increase the productivity of crops and livestock on existing land. And the reason we need to do that is because if we don't, the agricultural land footprint will continue to expand into what little's left of the remaining forest. So that's the second one. The third one, my colleagues will like here, but it's about using fisheries sustainably, and also taking more from aquaculture done in a sustainable way to take pressures off wild fish to allow them to recover. The fourth item was about protecting. linking productivity gains, land sparing strategies to the protection of the remaining natural ecosystems. And then finally, a whole slew of solutions that are really innovative around reducing the production-related greenhouse gas emissions of agriculture, which are about 12% of total greenhouse gas emissions.
Tom Philpott, how much of that list would you like to sign on to?
I'd like a whole lot of it. One thing that I would like to add to it is that I think that in the current system, in the current sort of world economic system, where we already have at this point, when we're sort of just moving into an era of climate change, we already have something like 1 billion people on the planet who aren't getting enough to eat. Yeah. And I think figuring out solutions to that problem are going to be absolutely crucial going forward, or we're going to see, this whole other situation that we're already seeing now of climate refugees, of people fleeing areas where there's food scarcity. And I think that it's essential to produce more and the crops be more productive and more resilient. But none of that is going to make a difference if we don't figure out a way to end systemic poverty that is already haunting us, and that it's like a time bomb that's going to go off if we don't figure something out about it. And so just sort of improving social safety nets worldwide, improving access to food. I mean, we're already way overproducing food with this massive hunger problem, and I think that is going to be a key challenge.
All right, Lori, let me get you to pick up, though, on the first couple of items that were on Janet's list there, reducing demand and shifting diets. I don't know about you, I don't see any, forgive the pun, I don't see any appetite among the public to do either of those two things at the moment. What's it going to take? Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't think that's the only thing it's going to take. So I think we shouldn't be putting all our emphasis on shifting diets. I think we need to be looking at things such as intensive livestock operations and why we're growing so much animal feed when animals could be on pasture. I think we do need to look at reducing how much meat we're eating. But I do believe that animals are part of a healthy farming system. And if you don't separate them out from the farming system, you don't have all that poop to deal with that ends up causing E. coli and romaine lettuce outbreaks and that sort of thing. It's actually a nutrient that can help us to grow more food. So if we start getting away from high input agriculture, that's really what we need to be doing. And that means getting away from agriculture that's super emphasizing fossil fuel inputs. So nitrogen-based fertilizers and nitrogen-based and other kinds of fossil fuel-based pesticides are really at the core of it. And that is going to change the way we start to grow and change the fact that we're then going to need more diversity in what we're growing. So it's not just about reducing meat, reducing protein.
No, I get that. It's not just about that. But Philip, where's the evidence that the public is prepared to dramatically reduce its meat intake in order to follow some of the items on this list here?
Well, the way that we eat today is relatively new. The amount of protein, amount of meat-based, animal-based protein in our diets in North America it's a relatively recent development in how we eat. And it's been a change over time that few people really haven't paid much attention to until now, the collective challenge of that and how we produce it. People change their behavior all the time in response to a variety of things, fads, trends, what we consider as being the affluent kind of meal, a sign of success. And I do think that there's interest. I teach undergraduate courses on sustainability, and whenever I let them sort of self-select what it is they see in their own behavior as wanting to change to make a difference, they are all on board with a plant-rich diet. They're not saying let's ditch meat, let's ditch fish, but they're on board with this idea of eating in a more responsible way.
Okay, Janet, in which case, let's make a little list here. Eat organic, go local, don't eat farm fish. If we do all those things, how close does that get us to where we need to be?
Yep, I'd like to answer that. I just first want to emphasise I'm not arguing that shifting diets is the only solution. I just laid out a very comprehensive 5-course menu of options.
That was just a couple of them.
On the issue of organic food, the challenge with organic food right now is there's a sort of yield penalty of around 20%. So what that means is now we need more land to produce food. So, if we want to feed the world in 2050 on an organic diet, we have to see significant and sustainable increases in the yields of the organic food system. So I want to put that there. I also want to give a quick call out to the city of Toronto, because they made a pledge to join the Cool Food Pledge, initiative where they've actually committed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by serving up more and delicious and tasty food. And to just answer the question about, well, we can't get people to shift diets. Let me just give you some examples. You know, we've been looking at the language of menus that you can use sort of behavioral nudges to get people to increase their likelihood that they'll order diets. Let me give you an example. You know, here it is, twisted garlic and ginger slow roast butternut squash, if you name it that, versus butternut squash with no added sugar. So, you know, just how you frame the dish. Whether you put the vegetarian dishes in the vegetarian box, because we found that if you do that, the only people that order them are obviously vegetarian. So there's a lot of these strategies that you can do to encourage people to voluntarily make better choices for their health and for the environment.
This next question has to go to the man from Mother Jones magazine, because large multinational food conglomerates, I wonder how much of an obstacle to the agenda that you have all been describing here, how much of an obstacle do you think they will be?
I think that on net they're a pretty massive obstacle, and I think that in things like, I mean, you've got a handful of companies that dominate, let's say, input markets for things like seeds and pesticides. These are the companies that farmers are buying from. So you've got this massive concentration in these markets. And these companies, just as an example, are very profitable under the current system. I mean, they ride up and down commodity waves, but even in their bad years, they're fairly profitable, because if everyone is growing corn and soybeans, then everyone's got to buy those seeds and they dominate those markets. And if they're growing monocultures, then they've got to buy the pesticides that, you know, basically they're creating this great habitat for pesticides that have to be killed with these pesticides that these companies grow, and so or market, and so they have a vested interest in continuing this situation. And we know that there are a lot of ways where you can maintain productivity, maintain yields, or even increase yields by adding biodiversity to systems. So adding a rotation of oats or a rotation of hay into a corn and soybean rotation, maintain the overall food production, but greatly decrease the use of chemicals. And that kind of system is not in those companies' interests. And so they will be, I think, an obstacle, and they have been an obstacle to policy change to get us away from the corn and soybean monocrop. And so, I mean, I think that's just one example of companies that are benefiting from the status quo are going to be dragged away from it kicking and screaming, I think.
Okay, we got some feedback in the studio to those comments. Philip first, then Laurie.
Yeah, just a point on sort of the broader question you're asking, and the comment about the productivity loss with organic. You know, part of what Tom just said sort of gets at why we see that. First of all, you know, growing organic, so to speak, it's a lot of different, describes a lot of different things. And there's good research that suggests it doesn't always have to be the case that you take the hit, right? And partly it's because are we reckoning food systems just for how much food they produce or for a portfolio of benefits? And maybe in some cases there's a little bit of a reduction in terms of the production of food, but you see benefits in terms of water, biodiversity, livelihoods, gender equity, all of these other things. And so I prefer to talk about the challenge with organic being more of a regime change one, where the challenge, if there is in fact a production issue, it's that it's still not the mainstream. It's still operating as the alternative to the mainstream. And whether that means people are farming in this way on less desirable land, or they don't have access to the best markets, there's a bit of a handicap there. And so it's not always a fair comparison.
Laurie, your take.
Well, Janet mentioned how the City of Toronto has just signed the Cool Food Pledge. And I would say one of the biggest tools we have is the procurement that we do, that institutions do, public sector institutions in particular, in terms of the City of Toronto runs long-term care facilities and childcare centers. There are hospitals, there are schools. If we push back through the food system by saying we want local, we want sustainably produced food, that's what we want to be purchasing, and we're using our millions of dollars to do that, I think that's going to start to have an impact on those big corporations and push back through the system to start to change the food system. It's very hard to put it on the individual, you know, that we have to change what we eat. Yes, we do, but we've got this incredibly powerful tool of public procurement, and we need to take take use of that.
Janet, I wonder whether you see, I mean, presumably corporations can see the writing on the wall. They're not too far away from a different party in power, for example, in Washington, D.C., from potentially seeing much more significant regulation in this area. And are they likely to lead the R&D required to make this transformation that we've talked about?
So yes, I actually think some of the biggest innovations we're going to see around, particularly around dealing with the production-related greenhouse gas emissions, are going to come from large corporations, hopefully with R&D support from governments. And I also want to kind of say that, you know, it's easy to paint the business as the bad guys, and in some cases they certainly are. But they're also the provider of solutions. And just to give you 3 examples, you know, the commitments by large food companies now to avoiding deforestation in their supply chain. So agriculture expansion is 80% of tropical forest deforestation. So those commitments, that's good. I was even talking to one company recently, Mars, the food company, and they've not only made a deforestation-free commitment in their supply chain, which are now cascading down. So it's kind of like the procurement thing that Laurie mentioned, but they've also committed to freezing their agricultural land footprint. And that, for a growing company like Mars, is a very significant endeavor. That means they have to increase the productivity on that land to be able to meet their market growth, which can be good for all those poor farmers, for example, in West Africa that are growing cacao with very low yields, because that's a way to, you know, help them rise them out of poverty. Second example, last week I was up at the Global Fertilizers Association meeting. Now, I don't know if you know, but only 47% of fertilizers that are added to the land actually are taken up by plants. The rest runs into the waterway system. It creates dead zones in lakes and coastal areas. You know, they've been doing innovations there around coatings to seeds, so slow release fertilizer, so there's more taken up by plants. Second thing is nitrogen inhibitors that you can add with the fertilizer, and it slows the release of nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas, from the application of fertilizers. And the third one was actually around the food waste issue. So a company in California, Appeal, have actually developed a thin layer, a biodegradable layer that you spray onto fruits and vegetables, and it kind of helps them preserve longer. And it kind of, it's a wall against bacteria. So, you know, to try and take a bite out of that 1/3 or 1/4, if you look at it by calories, of food lost between the field and fork.
In our remaining moments here tonight, I want to put some fake meat on the table here, figuratively, of course, not literally.
Yeah.
Here we go. Worldwide, it's estimated that livestock production accounts for 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. And so we are into a world now of beyond meat. It's stuff that tastes like meat, but it's not really meat. Straggling behind it is the promise of lab-grown meat. Yes, it's meat. It's grown in a lab. It's using the cells of a cow or a duck or a chicken. In 2013, Mosa Meat produced the world's first lab-grown beef burger at a cost of about 425,000 Canadian dollars. That may be a bit beyond our ability to pay. The cost is estimated by next year to be down closer to $10 American. That's a little more in the ballpark. Let's get into some discussion of this. Tom, you first. How important are these new technologies in terms of being part of the solution to create sustainable food of the future?
Well, first I want to say I'm skeptical of the lab-based meat concept, because we have been hearing for nearly a decade about we've got these really expensive lab-based meats that are already here, and next year they're going to get really cheap. Well, we've been hearing about that for a while, and I think there are some technological challenges that are going to be really hard to overcome. And on the sort of, conventional fake meats that are made out of soybeans or pea protein, I think those can be positive, but I think we get back to a situation where we get back to the concept that the problems that we have are so urgent that I think that we're going to need things like crop diversification to take place. Something like that's going to have much more of an impact than people gradually choosing to eat a Beyond Burger versus a regular hamburger. And so I think they are no substitute for the regulatory things that we need to happen, like, basically mandating crop diversification in the Midwest will go a lot longer of a way to solving the problem than the availability of a convincing fake meat burger.
Okay, let's get some views here in the studio. Laurie?
Well, it's the industrial food system that has got us into this pickle. I'm very skeptical with Tom that the industrial food system is going to provide the technological fix to get us out of this pickle. We have to look at how the food system in total starts to help us to adapt and change the way we do things to adjust to this crisis that we're facing. So I think the other problem, of course, is that these fake meats, their nutritional value is very unknown. Many of them are high fat, they're ultra-processed foods, and ultra-processed foods use a lot of energy to produce, and ultra-processed foods ultimately are leading to an epidemic of obesity and overweight. 75% of people in North America are overweight or obese. That is huge chronic health problems just waiting to happen. So we've got to address it in a much more holistic way than a technological fix.
Philip.
Well, we have heard a lot about sort of technological solutions in this conversation, and I feel like to some extent those are kicking the can down the road a little bit. And by that I mean, we started the conversation talking about population growth, and the need to feed people in a growing population. But what we know about population growth is that it happens in places that are struggling with poverty, that are struggling with food security and hunger, where women lack rights, where women lack education. Right? These are the root causes that I was talking about earlier. And when you can address those and at the same time address issues like the contributions of agriculture to climate change, if you don't address those, maybe we come up with tremendous crop technologies, great technologies for getting the nitrogen out of our water, great technologies for reducing methane from industrial-fed cows, but we still have the population growth problem. We still have all the underlying social problems that caused the challenge in the first place, and it will continue. And then we're just going to be dealing with whatever's next.
Janet, I hear you, Philip, but I wonder, the average person watching this right now, Janet, might think to themselves, there's not a lot I can do about civil rights in Afghanistan, but I can eat less meat, and I can change my diet a bit, and I can stop eating the bad stuff and start eating better stuff. Do we have to encourage that?
Yes, and let's not forget what Laurie mentioned. We have to, the average American in America also wastes 40% of their food.
Right.
So, yes, I think that's right. I also want to point out that, I mentioned earlier that beef in particular, is very land, greenhouse gas and water intensive, 20 times more than your average plant-based protein. And countries like Canada, the US, Europe, they consume a very large amount of beef per capita. But the challenge is that the rest of the world, as it sort of becomes urbanized, people are moving from rural areas to urban areas, their income rises, and one of the first things they do with that higher income is to eat more, meat-intensive foods. So that's a big challenge for us. So I think we have to sort of reduce the per capita meat consumptions in high countries to almost create planetary space for others in poorer countries to eat some more. So I wouldn't take lab meat or fake meat off, although I'd probably go for my twisted garlic butternut squash before those things. But I remember there's a saying by Winston Churchill. Maybe he was quite visionary, but he talked about the absurdity of growing a chicken just to eat its breast and wings. And he said, not long in the future we'll be able to just grow the breast and wings, and that was all those years ago. So. You never know.
When in doubt, it's never a bad thing to quote Winston Churchill. I agree.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I thank all four of you? Well, you're going to have to disagree next time you come back, Tom, because we're plumb out of time. Boy, a lot of food puns on the program tonight. Apologies for that. Can I thank Janet Ranganathan from the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C., Tom Philpott, look for his book, Perilous Bounty. You can read him in Mother Jones Magazine as well. Philip Loring from the University of Guelph, Laurie Stahlbrand from George Brown College. Great having all of you on TVO tonight. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.